I've been working a great deal with my counterpart in Mexico to deal with a lot of border security issues, and there's something called the Rule of Law Project in Mexico. They're actually changing their judicial system from an inquisitorial-based system to an advocacy-based system. Mm-hmm. And Chihuahua was the first state to do that reform. And so our AG's office has been training prosecutors and investigators in the Chihuahua AG's office to do these advocacy-based trials for the last 3 years. And then that program has spread now so that all of the Western Attorneys General, and I'm actually the chairman of the Western AGs this year, are training all of the Attorney General's offices in Mexico to deal with the change in the judicial system.
So what does that mean? You mentioned the change. Like, can you break that down a little bit?
Well, I think the reason I think it's so important, I think that this is probably one of the most important legal issues in our hemisphere, in the last 50 years, probably. But the Mexican system has previously always been one where you had a 3-judge panel, and the police would do an investigation, give their reports to the panel of judges, and they would decide whether you were guilty or not. Mm. But they're now actually changing more to a system like ours, where the defendant gets to appear at the trial, has the right to confront witnesses, has the right to cross-examination, and those kinds of things. And so one of the big initiatives that I have is working with my counterpart in Chihuahua. We have a joint memorandum of understanding to work together to combat human trafficking. And we also
created your office helped create New Mexico's human trafficking law.
Our office, there was no law in New Mexico when I became the Attorney General that prohibited human trafficking. There was a federal law that applied, but no state law. All the other states around us had a state law, so we passed the law. Actually, about the second year that I was the Attorney General, we weren't successful the first year because there were some issues. There were advocates for the victims who didn't like the first law that was introduced because they didn't think that it did enough to protect the victims of human trafficking. And so I convened a human trafficking task force that first summer that I was the Attorney General. We had all the NGOs and all the state agencies and some federal agencies that got together that talked about what we have to do to support the victims as far as giving them T visas if they're from out of the country so that they can stay here and testify, so that they can bring their families here so that they're safe. Providing just basic services, a place to live, interpreters if we need interpreters, some kind of support so that they can have food and such. So we developed all of that. Second year we were successful in passing the law through the legislature. We then have been training law enforcement in New Mexico to recognize the victims of human trafficking. And we've trained over 2,000 law enforcement officers in New Mexico in the last 2 years on how to recognize the victims, how to deal with the issues. And so we're starting to see now the results of that, because in the last 3 months or so we've had 3 indictments for human trafficking. Interestingly enough, all domestic human trafficking so far. The last one was a fellow that enticed a young girl from North Carolina to New Mexico, and then he was holding her hostage in his house and selling her on the internet, basically. And she was able to get a message out to the Albuquerque police, and they arrested the fellow, and then they turned that case over to us because of the expertise that my office has in prosecuting human trafficking. We work with law enforcement agencies all over the world. We share tips with each other. One of the most recent indictments we got was from a tip that we received from Canadian law enforcement, who told us that there was a young girl in a community in Canada that was getting solicited by somebody here in Albuquerque. So, but yes, it's actually a particular focus. We have a federal grant that's allowed us to increase our focus, but we've always had a unit that we call the ICAC unit for short. It's Internet Crimes Against Children, ICAC. And so I have agents who are specially trained to both to go on the internet and look for predators on the internet. For instance, we might get a call from a parent who's concerned about somebody that their child is chatting with, and if they give us permission, we could take over that account and carry on the chat and find out whether they're proposing something that's illegal. We have agents appear on the internet as children occasionally. Like I said, we get tips. If we participate in an arrest where somebody has child pornography on their computer, a lot of times there's information on the computer that will lead to to finding other people that they were file sharing with or whatever. And if they're in other states, we share that information with law enforcement in other states. My office has been recognized as being more active in dealing with public corruption than previous attorneys general offices. And the reason for that is, one, the first year that I was the Attorney General, I asked the legislature for additional funding to create what we call a government accountability unit. So I have a division in the agency that just works on public corruption issues. And so I have 3 lawyers in that unit now and 6 investigators, more or less. I can assign other investigators to work on cases depending on the caseload. But we have forensic accountants that can go through the books. We have other kinds of investigators. So we get tips from local government about local government corruption. We get tips about state government corruption. Those get assigned to our investigative agency, and they do the investigations, and they have some specialty in that. We have developed joint working agreements. One of the ones I've talked about is we work with the U.S. Attorney's Office in cases where there are potentially federal and state crimes, both that have been committed. And that was true in the Metropolitan Courthouse case. So in that case, the U.S. Attorney's Office took the lead, and we assigned a lawyer to work with them. So it was a joint prosecution effort between the AG's office and the U.S. Attorney's Office. We have cases that we're prosecuting on our own. The ones that are most well known are Jerome Block, the Public Regulation Commissioner, for misspending public funds during his campaign. Rebecca Vigil-Heron and 3 other defendants who were alleged to have misspent federal Help America Vote Act monies. The Region 3 Housing Authority, former legislators, Larry Manilos, and several other defendants who once again, and I'll say alleged in all these cases, they've been indicted, but the cases are still in the court system and haven't come to trial yet. But in the Region 3 Housing Authority case, it was mostly misspending money that was supposed to be used for low-income housing for purposes that didn't relate to building low-income housing. There are, in this case I just mentioned, there are actually 2 acts. There's the Whistleblower Act and there's the Fraud Against Taxpayer Act. What he's really talking about is the Fraud Against Taxpayer Act, because the Fraud Against Taxpayer Act allows private citizens to bring lawsuits, and on behalf of the state, if the state can't or won't bring them. But what under the Fraud Against Taxpayer Act, if you want to bring one of those cases, you have to give it to the Attorney General's office first under seal, and then we review the case, and then we decide whether you can move forward with it or not. And so we have, on the books, there are about 130 cases that have been filed under the Fraud Against Taxpayer Act. About 100 of those are actually filed in other states, and they just in class action suits, and they've raised the New Mexico Fraud Against Taxpayers Act as one of the laws that allows them to do that. And one of the reasons for that actually is that there's a small flaw in the New Mexico Fraud Against Taxpayers Act. Under every other KETAM statute, the federal one and all the other state ones, if you want to bring a lawsuit as the whistleblower, you have to prove that you have personal knowledge of the fraud. In New Mexico, you don't have to prove that. Anybody can be a relator. They call it under the Act. And so people can just read about a fraud in the newspaper and bring a lawsuit. Actually, they aren't very successful lawsuits, but what they want, they call these bounty hunt provisions too. So they think if they bring a lawsuit that they read about in the newspaper, that they can share in the attorney's fees. And so of those 100 cases, there are a certain fraction of them that are just people that read in the newspaper about some fraud, and so they just filed a copycat act. And so, indeed, we're sitting on this. I mean, we are trying to make sure that the cases that move forward are ones where there's actual proof of wrongdoing.